Hey guys, how you going? So in this session, we're going to look at energy flow in an ecosystems, and we're going to sort of investigate how the energy moves through different organisms in the ecosystem. Now that's just another way of really looking or investigating closely at food chains and food webs, which is the main form in which energy actually moves from one organism to another, getting eaten. All right. Now, all ecosystems actually require an external energy source, and usually that energy comes from the sun, which is why you sort of hear people saying that the sun, all life on Earth comes from the sun, because the sun drives photosynthesis for a lot of producers. And in other places around the Earth, hydrothermal vents, that is deep in the ocean floor, actually drives a different process called chemosynthesis for chemosynthetic bacteria. And so they take advantage of the heat from the Earth, and they're actually using chemical energy rather than photo energy. Yeah, the energy then moves from these primary resources into your different organisms. And so the different organisms, the way in which they actually get energy is how we categorize them. Yeah, so they come under three different groups. The first one is called the producers, and they are called producers or autotrophs because they are organisms that can actually produce their own energy sources from inorganic materials. Now, inorganic materials is your carbon dioxide, it is your water, and it is using the power of sunlight or chemicals to actually turn those things into organic materials. And so the producers are the first layer in your ecosystem. They use photosynthesis and chemosynthesis. These are your plants, your algae, your bacteria. The second level are your heterotrophs, or your consumers. Yeah, they obtain energy from organic material. We use the term consumers is because they actually consume another organism in order to get that energy. Right? So a herbivore, an animal like a cow, would need to consume another organism such as grass in order to get energy. Carnivores, if you were talking about wolves that hunt deer, the wolves get their energy by eating the deer. And then you also have detritivores, which are they eat dead or decaying organic matter. Yeah, so we're now moving and talking really about the animals and the fungus and things like that. Decomposers are organisms that break down organic material back into its inorganic substances. Yeah, so fungus and bacteria are really good at breaking down rotting, decaying material and turning it back into inorganic substances, and they're kind of your recycling in your ecosystem. Alright, let's take a look at the producers, or the autotrophs. They produce their own energy source. Here are three different types of ecosystems, and being able to identify their producers is really helpful because it's the foundation of that particular ecosystem. The first one is actually a temperate marine kelp forest. Now this is in the temperate area, and it's in a marine environment, and the producers here are the kelp. The kelp is a type of algae, and it is the basis for this particular ecosystems because the kelp can photosynthesize, and then all different organisms will then live off by eating the kelp or living inside the kelp. Yeah. The second one is Antarctica. So, a marine ecosystem in Antarctica doesn't have any plants, but it still has producers. And so the producers here are species of what we call phytoplankton. That is plankton, small microscopic or microorganisms that are able to photosynthesize in the water. And so those phytoplankton are really important in this particular environment because other organisms then consume them in order to get their energy, and then it powers that particular ecosystem. The third one is probably something that we're a bit more familiar with, a temperate closed forest. We have a lot of that here in Victoria because Victoria is in a temperate region. And so the producers here are your woody flowering plants, the ferns and the mosses that establish themselves in these forests. Yeah, so you can see there different environments, but all of them having something in common in order to be a thriving ecosystem, and that is a large base or community of producers. Okay. Now the consumers, we call them heterotrophs. the consumers obtain the energy by consuming other organisms, yeah, and so we categorize them differently, yeah. We break them down into what type of kind of organisms that they consume. The primary consumer are your herbivores. They're the ones that eat the plants. They eat the producers in the ecosystem. They eat the plants, the algae, and the phytoplankton, and so forth. Your secondary consumers are your carnivores. They are the ones that now eat the herbivores. And then you've also got a tertiary consumer, which is also a carnivore, but it's a carnivore that eats other carnivores. And so, as you can sort of see that it works away as primary, secondary, and tertiary. There is also another layer called the quaternary consumer, meaning kind of the fourth level. But generally, we don't really need to get into the details of that. You've got fifth level, sixth level, and so forth of consumers, and it just sort of keeps going. But we really only focus on primary, secondary, and tertiary. The organism that's usually at the top of the food chain, that is nothing really eats it, is what we call the apex predator, or the top predator in the ecosystem. Yeah. Now, one of the things that you probably need to understand is that organisms don't always fit neatly into one category. Sometimes they overlap a little bit. Yeah. Some organisms will consume both plants and other insects. Yeah. And so we actually have names for them. Omnivores are both a primary consumer and a tertiary consumer, and so primary and secondary or tertiary consumer, and so we call them omnivores. And a detritivore is just anything that eats decaying organic matter, whether it's plant or animal material. And so those things don't fit neatly into categories, but and we have different names for them as well. Okay, so how we represent this energy flow is through food chains and food webs, and they're both kind of the same concept, but the food chain is just one line. So in this case here, you can see this here is a food chain, and this here is a food chain as well. And a food web, which we'll look at a little bit later, is basically multiple food chains put together. Yeah. One of the things to note here is that when you look at food chains and food webs, you use arrows to connect different organisms together, and the arrows always point into the direction of the predator, meaning it shows which way the energy is flowing to. Yeah, it's flowing towards the predator. So here are two different ecosystems, a terrestrial ecosystem and an aquatic ecosystem. And you can see there the different layers again: producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and quaternary consumers. And in this case here, a terrestrial one could be a flowering plant, which gets eaten by the primary consumer being the grasshopper, the secondary consumer being the mouse, the tertiary being the snake, and then your apex predator or your quaternary consumer being the hawk. Conversely, if you look at an aquatic food chain where there may not be plants, you've got phytoplankton that live in the water column. Now, these phytoplankton are eaten by what we call zooplankton, which are also microscopic organisms, but they eat the phytoplankton. And then something like a herring or a small fish will eat the zooplankton, and then the herring are targeted species by tuna, and then tuna are also targeted by killer whales. And so the killer whale here is your apex predator. So that just kind of shows neatly a food chain. And one of the things that I would love for you guys to be able to do is when you sort of see the interplay between organisms in an ecosystem, you should begin to be able to match together the food chains and the food webs that occur within that ecosystem. A food web looks a little bit more complicated, but the principles are roughly the same. It always has to start from one side, moving to the other side, unless it's a really badly drawn food web. Okay, so here is a food web that you can sort of see. You've got berries, you've got grasshoppers, you've got butterflies, frogs, snakes, buzzards, and foxes, and rabbits, and so forth and so forth. The layer that you usually should be able to identify the easiest is the producer, which are usually the ones that sit at the bottom of that food web. Yeah, so the berries and the plantains are the producers. Your primary consumers, yeah, the ones that eat them, the ones that arrow is pointing directly to, are your rabbits, the mouse, the grasshopper, the butterfly, and the green fly. Now, the titmouse is also a primary consumer, but we'll come back to that in just 1 second. Okay, the secondary consumers is the ladybird. Okay, and it is the only one that is just a secondary consumer. Okay, so you can see that there's a few others as well. Once again, the frog is a secondary consumer, and so is the fox and the buzzard. Okay, but we'll come back to that. Okay, the dragonfly is the only tertiary one, and you can see here there are a few animals here that are both primary and secondary, and in some cases tertiary as well. So the titmouse here actually doesn't fit neatly into any particular category. You can actually call it a primary consumer, secondary, or tertiary. But in this particular case, I'm just going to call it a primary/secondary consumer. And the frog also doesn't fit neatly into any particular category, so we're going to label him a tertiary consumer, but you can call him a quaternary as well, because you can sort of see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 connections. The snake is technically can be up to 5, but we're going to also call him the same thing, a tertiary consumer. And your last two are the apex predators, the buzzard and the fox. And so you can see there that the food web is really just many different food chains put together. And when you look at a food web, hopefully you should be able to immediately identify the different chains in your food webs. Okay, so that is just a bit of an overview of the food web. This isn't the only way we actually classify different organisms as whether they are consumers or producers and so forth. There is also another way that we can do it, and we actually call them trophic levels. And so trophic levels simply means feeding level, where trophic means feeding, and each trophic level is basically an equivalent to the producers and consumers in the ladder. So if I was to translate consumers and producers into the trophic level method of understanding food chains, you would say that the producers is the first feeding level. It's the first trophic level, and then your primary consumers is your second trophic level, secondary consumers is your third trophic level, and tertiary consumers is your fourth trophic level. So in that way, we don't have to worry too much about tertiary, primary consumers, and so forth, and we just use first, second, third, and fourth. Okay. One of the things that is worth noting, however, is that because organisms don't convert all of their energy that they eat from food into their bodies, you actually lose energy as you go up. So the amount of energy that's in organisms over time actually decreases as you go further up the feeding level. All right? In chapter 6, we talked about how your body is not very good at using all of its energy, and a lot of the energy gets wasted as heat. The same thing can be said for a lot of different organisms. When they consume food, they release some of that energy as heat and other things as well. And so you lose a bit of energy every time you go up. And so it's represented as a bit of a pyramid. By the time you get to the fourth trophic level, you only get very little energy that you would initially had right down at the first trophic level, which is why most food chains and food webs don't go past the fourth trophic level, because you kind of run out of energy. Yeah. Now the last section are the decomposers. So decomposers are heterotrophs, but they are the ones that are really good at recycling. So they're the ones that actually break down dead or dying organic matter. Doesn't matter whether it's plant or animal material, but they're the stuff that actually recycles the stuff. When something is rotting, it means there's a decomposer that is actually consuming that food and turning it back into its inorganic constituents. Yeah, so it recycles material in an ecosystem. And they include things like worms, maggots, bacteria, and so forth as well. But it's a little bit confusing because decomposers and detritivores are very similar. Okay, usually things like bacteria and fungi represent your decomposers. So when you put a piece of bread out there and then it starts to go moldy, that's decomposition. It's decomposing, and there are organisms actually breaking it down. Some general technical words. Detritus usually just means dead, decaying organic matter. Earthworms, which is why earthworms are so good to have in the soil. Mushrooms, toadstools, vultures, and bacteria are just a few of those examples. Okay. Alright, so that's it for this particular chapter. Next chapter, we're going to take a look at Trophic Cascade and how changing food webs and food chains can actually have dramatic changes in the stability of the ecosystem. Okay, so see you guys then.